Hi, my name's Maggie Piepenbrink, and I teach 4th grade at Hanby Elementary in Mesquite, Texas. This summer, I was selected as one of 5 teachers across the country to participate in NASA's Reduced Gravity Education Flight Week. We got to fly on what most people call the Vomit Comet. It's actually not the Vomit Comet. The Vomit Comet has been retired for a while, but it's still a zero-G aircraft that we fly with NASA, and ours was called the G-Force 1. We flew with a group of NASA engineers and some college students, and we all tested experiments to see how they would react in microgravity and hypergravity. The plane that we were on was basically like a regular commercial airplane that you would take to get anywhere across the country. However, almost all of the seats were taken out. They had a few in the back for us to sit in while we took off and landed. And then the rest of the plane was completely covered in padding, and that was because otherwise we could possibly injure ourselves when we were floating around and coming back down. So it was a completely padded plane, and there were straps everywhere to hold on to, and it was pretty cool because we wanted as much room to float around as possible. Our plane would fly out, and we would go over to the Gulf of Mexico down to the very tip of Texas because we were leaving from Houston. And we would fly in military airspace. We had up to 2.1 flight hours, so our total time from the time we took off to the time that we landed, we had to finish in 2.1 flight hours, otherwise we'd have to pay money. And the flight actually cost, I believe they said, $41,000 per hour. Now, we had 2 flight days, and each flight day had a maximum of 2.1 flight hours. So that's a lot of money that people were paying for us to do these experiments. So we had to make sure we were actually using our time wisely. And basically our plane would fly out and we'd do parabolas, like what a roller coaster would normally do. But this was in a giant airplane. And so we would go 45 degrees up. And while we were doing that, we had 1.6 to 1.8 Gs against us. Now, on Earth, we have 1 G, just like regular Earth gravity. And so 1.6, 1.8 doesn't quite sound like much, but that's almost 2 times your weight. And so anything that you're doing, you feel twice as heavy. So when you're laying down or sitting up, which are like the 2 ways that they wanted us to do during this time, you just felt like you were ginormous and that you were just like sinking into the plane. And so you didn't quite feel like much, if you're doing that. But when you sit up, you can kind of feel a little more. I would lay down because I didn't really want to puke, and I felt better laying down. And so I would push up my arms like I was like bench pressing. And it felt like I had like the bar and a whole lot of weights on my arms. And I was like, this is so weird. And I just kept doing that because it's kind of fun. And then the plane, once it got to the certain altitude that we had to be at, would basically start, they'd turn the plane and you could hear it. It was really creepy. You could hear basically the engines. They weren't shutting down, but they stopped, supplying fuel to the plane. So they stopped gassing it, and the plane would tilt 30 degrees down, and the pilots would basically just let it go. And we basically free fell down to the earth, plummeting down to the earth. It was kind of scary when they were describing it. But inside the plane, all the windows are covered, so you can't really see anything. But it was amazing, and our microgravity time would last anywhere between 20 and 40 seconds, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you do it 40 times, it kind of lasts a while. Like I said, we had 40 parabolas. We had 32 in microgravity, 4 in lunar gravity, which is like the moon, and then we had 4 in Martian gravity, which is what Mars has. And so it's kind of cool. During the lunar ones, we were kind of like doing the moonwalk, and we were doing push-ups. You could do like one-handed push-ups and push yourself up and clap a few times and go back down. And so it's kind of fun. You kind of felt like Superman for a little bit. We were having a little bit of fun when we were able to. But we also had to test our experiment. The experiment that we tested on our flight day, our group of 5 teachers was split up into 2 different flight days. I was the first flight group. And the experiment we tested was something that was kind of built off what they have on the International Space Station. Now, the International Space Station is, flying up way above the Earth, and they're basically in a constant free fall. And they're going, I think it's 17.5 thousand miles per hour, and they're just constantly falling around the Earth, and so they're just kind of circling. And the astronauts, whether they're from the USA or from Russia or Japan or wherever they're from, they have to make sure that they're healthy because, they're astronauts. They're not going to be able to, get a doctor up there whenever they want to and just bring them back. And so one thing that NASA has them do is they have to, weigh themselves. Now, when we weigh ourselves on Earth, we have a scale, and that scale uses gravity to, you put yourself down, and basically the gravity pushes down on the scale, and that tells you how much you weigh. They don't have gravity like we have gravity in the International Space Station, and so what they do is they strap themselves into a big chair, and basically this machine oscillates them back and forth, and so they're just kind of like shaking, and the rate that they shake at tells you how much they're weighing, because they do lose muscle mass and things because they're not using their legs like they normally would. And so what we did was we had a giant contraption with like a hacksaw blade that was like covered in tape so it was safe, and we were weighing weights in film canisters to see how the oscillation rate would change, whether we were on Earth gravity or in Martian gravity or lunar gravity or microgravity. And we, that the weight is basically a vertical scale, and what we did was we were doing it horizontally, so we thought there would be no change, and there wasn't. It was kind of cool. But we had 3 positions on our team, and so one person was the person that was in charge of placing the weights inside the little canister, and they would pull the lever back, and they'd let it go, and whenever we'd stop, whenever we'd call time, they'd have to take the weight out and put it back on the Velcro strip before we went back into hypergravity, because when you have it, twice as much weight, we didn't want the hacksaw blade to break and have this, sharp, pointy object floating around inside our experiment, because that really just doesn't sound like much fun. And then we had a second person who would sit behind the experiment, because it was a big glass box, and they would count the oscillations rate. So every time that it went, they had to count it and make sure they were on time. And they had a little lap board that was strapped to their knee, and it's basically a little clipboard, and they would write down however many rates it was, and whether it was a microgravity or lunar gravity or Martian gravity parabola, and what parabola it was, and all this information. And then the third position was a timer, and basically all they did was they would time for 15 seconds to make sure that we didn't go over, because that was our constant. We had 15 seconds for each different canister that we used, and so that was trying to make sure that we only use 15 seconds, because the more time that you give it, of course, it's going to have a higher oscillation rate. And so the 2 girls that I was with, they're like, oh, I want to do this, I want to do this. And I was like, I'll be the timer, that's fine with me. Because in my mind, I was thinking, timer, okay, they don't really have to pay as much attention. I feel like maybe I'd get less sick if I did the timer. And so I was like, I'll do the timer. One of the benefits of the timer, I didn't have to necessarily pay attention to what they were doing inside the experiment. So I would, say, are you ready? Okay, go. And I'd click the timer. And I would just kind of float around because it was microgravity. Of course, I'm going to try that. And so I would we had to hold on. We had to make sure our head stayed above our feet, because otherwise, if your feet are above your head and, you're, instead of being right side up, you're upside down, when you come out of the microgravity, it's a very sudden thing. It's like, okay, we're going down, and you just fall. And so that's why they had padding. And so they had to make sure, you're right side up. And they wanted you to hold on because they didn't want you floating around the cabin and landing on someone else's experiment. And so I'd just kind of like hold on or kind of float around and grab something else. And I'd just make sure I gave them like the countdown to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, stop, pull it out, go. And so I just kind of got to float around. Well, about 2/3 of the way through our microgravity parabolas, Joanne started feeling a little sick. And she was the person that was in charge of starting the experiment. And so she started feeling a little sick. She was laying down during one of the hypergravity parts where we're going up. And you see her grab her little barf bag, which is inside the zipper of her flight suit. And I'm just going, oh, no, I don't want to see this. I don't want to see this at all. And so I turn away, and you just start hearing the puke. Luckily, she did make it into her bag, because otherwise, if you don't puke into your bag, when you hit microgravity, everything that's loose floats. Don't exactly want to run into someone's puke while you're floating around the plane. Nor do you also want it to puke while they're in microgravity, and then you hit the 2Gs and it all goes splat everywhere. So she did make it into the barf bag. Someone on the flight the second day didn't, and that was rather gross, we heard. But she did make it in there. She had to be escorted to the back of the plane because she just kept getting sick. Her flight meds that she got didn't quite work as well as the ones that I did. I guess she was a little too close in the weight zone. And so I didn't puke. I was very excited because that's, I was like, if I puke, it'll be epic because you're puking in microgravity. That's awesome. But I really didn't want to puke, and so luckily I didn't. But it was amazing. Microgravity, is you're just free falling because you can't really have zero gravity because there's always a pull of something, no matter how distant it is. There's still a pull. But microgravity was amazing. Everyone's like, okay, so what did it feel like? And the best thing I can say that it felt like was almost like you were in a swimming pool floating around. Of course, you didn't have to, breathe or anything. You could breathe normally. You didn't have to hold your breath. But you also didn't feel the weight of the water, obviously. You're just there. And it was so cool when you started making the parabola and you'd, float down. You could feel yourself pull up and you're like, whoa, okay, this is awesome. And you just kind of popped up because you wanted to do this. It was so cool. If I ever get the chance again, I will be on that in a heartbeat because it was amazing.